In this video, we briefly talk about ACES before discussing it at length later on in the rendering section of the course. Obviously, it's quite soon to talk about ACES as we progress through the course, but as I'll be using ACES workflow throughout the course, I just wanted to give you a quick introduction about what ACES is and how to set it up properly in Redshift. When Redshift 3.0.46 came out, Maxon decided to make ACES the default color space in Redshift. That means the moment you change your render to Redshift, you are working in ACES and there is nothing you need to do. There is basically no setup involved. You just have to worry about your textures and make sure they are in proper color space. We'll talk about that in a moment. So ACES is a system of color spaces and color management solutions that through a set of mathematical specifications and guidelines allows for a fully encompassing color accurate workflow with seamless interchange of high quality images and textures regardless of source. That is a very loose definition of what ACES is, and it has certain advantages when implemented in a CGI rendering workflow, like a much wider and brighter and saturated ranges of colors and lights can be used without having to deal with burnout highlights and inaccurate colors. Or simply put, it's very good at preserving highlights, shadows, and colors. Let's just leave it at that for now. I know you are probably more confused than when we started this video, but more detailed explanation will be given in the ACES lesson in the rendering section of the course. If you open up render settings and set the mode to advanced and go to the globals tab, you find this color management section, which, as I mentioned, it has been configured to be in ACES by default, and you don't need to know more than that right now. We will talk about all of these settings in the ACES video in the rendering section of the course. The only thing we need to do is to make sure that our textures and HDRIs are properly interpreted to work with ACES. And you basically have three types of textures. Textures that control your color inputs, like your diffuse or reflection color. Textures that control the data inputs like reflection roughness, displacement, or bump inputs. And finally, your HDRIs that you assign them to your lights, for example, for image-based lighting. And for these three types of textures, you need to consider proper color spaces. So let's open up the render view and start the IPR. And let's take this wood shader or parquet shader, for example. The diffuse color of the texture is being controlled by this parquet texture. And as it is a color input, the color space needs to be set to sRGB. And if I set the color space to other available options here, you notice the shader appears to be incorrect in the render. So color inputs needs to be set to sRGB. The second, third, and fourth textures control reflection roughness and bump inputs. The color space for them will be raw. And finally, let's take a look at this HDRI image that provides the image-based lighting within a Redshift dome light. The color space for this texture needs to be set to Scene Linear Rec 709 sRGB. So that's how you set up your textures when working with ACES, and Redshift will take care of the rest of the setup. One last thing I want to quickly talk about is how to save out a render that is done in ACES space. If you are a beginner and don't know much about ACES, I would actually recommend to skip the rest of the video, as I'll have to use terms that might not help you out right now in your journey. But if you are a bit more advanced, watch the rest of the video so you can save out your renders properly while working with ACES. I won't go into much details now, just a brief explanation. You can watch the main ACES video in the rendering section. There are two scenarios. There are more, but let's keep it simple for now. You are either rendering your final render directly in the render view or through Cinema 4D's save options with picture viewer, right? If you render your scene with render view and you didn't want to do any post-processing or color correcting in your compositing app, you can simply save it out to JPEG or PNG, and the saved out image should look exactly one-to-one to the render you see in the render view, because the view transform will be applied to the saved out image. But if you want to save an EXR and do the proper ACES conversion in post, which we discuss it in the rendering section of the course, you can simply use the save from the file menu and save your render to EXR. In that way, the saved out EXR image in the compositing app will appear incorrect, but that is what it is supposed to look like because the image was saved without applying view transform, and you do that in post to have more control. But if you are rendering with Cinema 4D's native options and want to save a JPEG or PNG image without the need to any post-processing or color correcting, you don't need to change any of the default settings. The saved out image will look exactly as the render in the picture viewer. But if you want to save an EXR and do the proper ACES conversion in post, you need to go to the render settings under globals and come down to the color management section. Simply change the view transform to raw and disable compensate for view transform, and that way the render in the picture viewer as well as the saved out EXR image in the compositing app will look incorrect. But that is again what they are supposed to look like because the image was saved and viewed in the picture viewer without applying view transform, and you do that in post to have more control. We'll discuss these issues with detailed examples in due time, but for now this should be enough. ACES will be discussed later on in much more detail, but this lesson was designed so you are able to follow along properly if I used ACES workflow in any of the future lessons, which is basically the entire courses I'll be working entirely and exclusively in ACES. Just a quick update folks regarding how to set up ACES. I have recorded the lesson on setting up ACES in Redshift when the latest release of Redshift was 3.0.51. If I remember correctly. When Maxon released Cinema 4D R25 and Redshift 3.0.56, they have reorganized and regrouped the ACES color spaces. Other than that, nothing has changed. So if I open up this Parquet material, for example, and select the diffuse color texture, to change the color space to sRGB, just click on the color space button and you'll find that sRGB color space under this File IO category. If we select the reflection roughness, bump, and normal texture to change their color spaces to raw, simply go to the File IO section and you'll find the raw color space there. And the same thing is true about the HDRI textures. If I select the dome light, you can find the scene sRGB under the File IO category. Just wanted to let you know to avoid any confusion, as I have recorded the first few chapters of the course prior to Redshift 3.0.56. So whenever I change the color spaces for my textures throughout the course, you can find those color spaces under this File IO category. Great, let's move on.